Should we move that mic to the center? Okay. Is that all right? Good. Okay.
Yes.
As the spring progressed into early summer, the Paleo Indians would begin an annual trek northward along the foothills where small groups of 20 to 60 people would camp and hunt in the forests and mountain meadows as far north as southern Wyoming. By late summer, when berries were ripe and other edible plants abundant in the higher alpine zone, they would have crossed the divide in via one or more of the northern passes, such as Cameron or Kashlapuder Pass, hunting and gathering in the upper Colorado River Valley. They were still ranging in separate bands as far south as Hot Sulphur Springs. By early fall, when the herds of deer and elk and bighorn sheep were grazing high above timberline, they would camp just below the open alpine ridgetops in the scrub spruce, or crumholts as we call it, near a spring or a small stream. Banding together then, several bands, maybe as many as 4 of the smaller bands would band together to create enough manpower to engage in game drive hunting, making use of stone walls that they'd erected down through the years, actually should say down through the centuries. These walls were not high, probably less than 3 feet. Long straight walls just below the ridgetop often led into open V-shaped walls that with blinds built by digging pits deep enough to hide 1 or 2 people. The Paleo Indians would take advantage of the animals' natural reluctance to step over the walls unless they were extremely frightened or being crowded, and running. The game drive walls were placed so that animals moving toward them would have the prevailing wind to their back. And the presence of the driving Indians slowly walking toward the game herds would cause them to begin moving away. Sometimes just the pushers, all they needed was their scent carried by the wind to cause the herd to travel together in the direction that the herders wanted them to go. At the end of the long wall and at the mouth of the V or open U-shaped walls, many hunters with spears, atlatls, or clubs would be hiding in the blinds and could kill game fairly easily. There are 40 or more recorded game drive sites along the northern portion of the Front Range where the Continental Divide is offset eastward by the Middle Park Basin. In the most recent archaeological reports on studies of game drives that I could find, the author states, quote, "No large-scale tundra drive game systems are known to exist elsewhere in the mountains of northern Colorado."
But they were wrong. In the summer of 1993, Gary St. Clair from the Peck House in Buff made a late summer camping trip to the headwaters of Mad Creek and up on Cone Mountain. If he had not had the pleasure of meeting a then active archaeologist, John Slay, who was living in Fort Collins and working for the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest, he would not have known what Gary and he had found. John and he had met earlier to discuss a quite different archaeological discovery he had made on top of the divide above the Eisenhower Tunnel, but that's another story and another time. John described the game drive sites he had done research on, and Buff, of course, became interested also. When Gary and Buff saw the remains of those walls, he wasn't sure what they were, but he knew they were much, much older than anything he had seen that the prospectors of 150 years ago had dug or built. Buff and I, along with our son-in-law Angelo, went back to Cone Mountain in the summer of 1994 and took pictures of the walls. Buff's brother Bill and he took John Slay along with several Forest Service personnel from the Clear Creek Ranger Station to see the site in the summer of 1995. The site was recorded and a few artifacts found, but there has been no activity since. Radiocarbon testing of charcoal found at other sites that have been archaeologically excavated have dated the earliest at 8000 BC and the youngest at 265 BC, which makes the newest 2,273 years old by our calendar. There is then evidence of hunting in Clear Creek County for a long, long time. The type of hunting life and hunting methods we have described continue for many years. Changes in hunting methods were brought about by wars with the Plains Indians and possibly changes in weather patterns. The biggest change was probably when they began to make and use the bow and arrow. Before any white man, even the earliest trappers arrived in the mountains, the descendants of the Paleo-Indian tribes had horses. The game drive system was no longer used.
Western Indian tribes hunting in Clear Creek County. I haven't researched through archaeological studies in the Anasazi people of that era before the arrival of the Spaniards in Colorado, but my guess is that probably scarcity of game or on the plains brought on by drought or a large increase in the Indian population caused changes in the game animals' natural migration and feeding areas. There's evidence of buffalo in the mountains of Clear Creek County. According to a story my father told me, at least one buffalo skull was found in the Argentine Pass area. For many years, the Arapaho Indians of the plains, who were primarily buffalo hunters, would move up into the mountains in the summer where it was cooler and where there were less insects. Game also moved higher for the same reasons. The mountain Ute Indian tribes, who wintered in the lower valleys of the Colorado River and its tributaries, considered the Continental Divide Mountains, at least as far down as the Alpine zone on the eastern side, their hunting grounds. This, of course, led to many conflicts with raids on both sides on their opponents' camps, to the detriment, of course, of hunting and the lives and activities of the squaws and the children.
Intervention of the white hunters, the use of firearms, big change. When colonists from European countries arrived in North America, they were not hunters. They had come from a land and a society where all wild game animals belonged to the ruling royalty. To be caught with any dead game animal could mean death. These farmers soon began to copy the Indians in their skills at stalking wild game. Some of them that we all know, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, became quite proficient at it. They, of course, showed the Indians a better, faster, and more positive way to kill wild game with the use of firearms. This was the beginning of the demise of the game animals that once abounded throughout the country. The westward migration of land seekers, later accelerated by the discovery of gold in California and then gold and silver in Colorado, brought hordes of people who arrived when the plains still supported thousands of buffalo and the foothills and mountains were the home of many thousands of deer, elk, and bighorn sheep. We might describe this picture a little bit. This is Rose Street. Oh, as you can see, it says so. If you can figure out what we're looking at. And because these are pack animals with the game on their backs, we feel that these have probably been killed within the county. If they had been in Grand County or Summit County, the game would be brought in wagon loads of carcasses. But these are hunters showing off their magnificent horns of animals. Decline of the big game herds. The hordes of newcomers, at least in the mountains, were not farmers who could raise domestic livestock to feed their families, but miners, lumberjacks, and business owners. While the buffalo on the plains were being slaughtered, often only for their hides, and to make room for the thousands of cattle being brought up from Texas, The big game animals in the mountains were being hunted to satisfy the local meat markets. The mountains of Clear Creek County were not spared from the guns of the market hunters. To the further detriment of big game, the coming of the railroad expanded the market for game meat and hides to the Midwest and Eastern states. By the mid-1860s, sport hunters from Europe and the eastern United States were attracted to the Colorado foothills and mountains to hunt for trophy animals. Market hunting and the wasteful slaughter of game in the name of sport continued until the game was gone. Colorado Territory got its first governor in 1861, and the first legislative assembly convened in September of that year. The only law considering wild game that they passed was to make it illegal to take trout by seine, net, basket, or traps.
By 1866, lawmakers were being pressured by sportsmen's clubs and early conservationists to pass laws that would restrict open hunting year-round. Not wanting to risk disfavor among their constituents in the mountain counties, they passed a very stringent law concerning the shooting of most upland game birds. But they did pass the first big game law in December of 1966, and it became law in January 1867, making it illegal to kill or have in possession any elk, deer, antelope, mountain sheep, or wild turkey between January 15th and August 15th every year. So instead of setting a hunting season, what they had really done was to set a season when you couldn't hunt, and that wasn't all that long. Then the rest of the year was open to hunt all big game with no requirement for a license and no limit on the number of or the species of game killed. Market hunting was still legal and in the open season. And of course buffalo were too few to even be considered in the eyes of the law, and they were right, because the last buffalo was killed by trophy hunters in Colorado in 1897. Before that time, by that time, game was all but gone, and as an act of shutting the barn door after the horse is gone, legislation was passed to stop any killing of bighorn sheep, antelope, deer, and wild turkeys any time of year, with no open season allowed at all. Elk were added to the protection list in 1897 also, but there was no provision for enforcing the law.
Turn of the century laws and enforcement. When the state legislation finally addressed the need to protect game animals, they let the pendulum swing all the way to the other side. Protecting game meant not allowing anyone to kill any protected animal at all. In April of 1899, the state legislature established the Colorado Department of Game and Fish with the power to enforce the game laws and fine the offenders. Even so, the lenient laws were allowing much too lengthy hunting seasons and bag limits too high to sustain the remaining game herds. The first areas to be depleted of big game were closest to the urban areas and around the mining towns in the mountains, Clear Creek County being in both categories. In April of 1903, Colorado issued its first hunting license. A resident hunting license cost $1. Allowed you to hunt any legal game during any open season all year. By 1907, deer were the only big game animal that could be legally hunted, and they were very scarce except on the western slope where they had mountain meadows and access to hay fields. With stronger restrictions and an increase in the number and salaries of game wardens, big game began to come back. Big game had increased enough by 1929 that you could buy a hunting license for either a deer or elk. From the turn of the century, Colorado had imported elk to reestablish the dwindling herds.
Depression era hunting. In 1916, through the efforts of several Pueblo businessmen and the Pueblo Elks Lodge, 50 elk were purchased from the surplus at the Jackson Hole refuge in Wyoming. Half of the train car load, or 25 elk, were transferred to the narrow gauge line in Golden and brought to Idaho Springs. And I've seen a picture of them unloading the elk in Idaho Springs, but I could not find it. I searched everywhere I know to look, but if I ever do, no, I'm not going to mail you each a copy. Anyway, they were released then in Idaho Springs, and how they got them from the train station in Idaho Springs up Chicago Creek to where they wanted to put them, I don't know. But by 1929, the Mount Evans imported elk had increased to a fairly good-sized herd living in the Chicago Creek and Bear Creek basins. There was, however, no hunting allowed. In fact, when elk were reintroduced there in 1916, a game preserve was created that included all the land in Clear Creek County east of the main fork of Clear Creek and extending into Jefferson County. When I was growing up in the 1930s and early 1940s, there were no elk that you could hunt in Clear Creek County, and deer were scarce. And technically, it was illegal to hunt anything, even rabbits, on the other side of Clear Creek, which is, yes, Bob?
Buff, are you in the picture?
Yes, yeah, this is my older brother Bill, me in the middle, and my younger brother John there. And this was taken at Bear Tracks Lakes when they first opened the Mount Evans area, reopened it to elk hunting. It was taken up at Bear Tracks Lakes. And we were familiar with the country because we'd spent the summer repairing the trails, doing trail work for the Forest Service after the 10th Mountain Infantry had left. There's more about that further on down. Anyway, the game preserve was kept in force clear up until about 1944, I believe it was. And of course, poaching in the Depression years became more common, and I'm sure some game wardens looked the other way if they thought the illegal meat was going to feed a needy family. My father had hunted since he was a boy and tried to continue hunting in the Depression years, and game was a little more plentiful on the western slope. So my first big game hunting trips were with my dad, my uncle, and brothers into Middle Park. My older brother and I were too young to hunt big game, but went along with the hunters to learn how to find and stalk game and to enjoy camping. They hunted deer, but would sometimes encounter a small band of elk near timberline in the Williams Fork River Basin. Dad let us carry 22 rifles, and we sometimes shot grouse and rabbits, which made good camp meat. My older brother went on to become a wildlife biologist with the Colorado Division of Wildlife.
Return of the big game herds. As so often happens when game preserves are created, the number of animals increases to beyond the comfortable carrying capacity of the habitat. In some instances, that would mean starvation for some of the herd. In the case of the Mount Evans herd, it only meant that the elk had to spread out to find new ground. Elk are good fence jumpers, so boundaries were no problem to them. During World War II, the Mount Evans herd had grown to where they became a nuisance in the lower Bear Creek Valley. They had also spilled over into the upper valleys of South Park, where ranchers had trouble keeping them out of their haystacks. The Division of Wildlife refused to open the preserve to hunters and had to resort to hiring shooters to kill surplus elk. The meat was not wasted, however. It was given to needy causes. But the cost of this process, the killing and butchering, had to come out of the Game and Fish's limited budget. In the early years of the war, companies of the 10th Mountain Division, Infantry Division, used the trails and open slopes on the north and east drainages of Mount Evans for bivouac and training of ski troops, mule pack companies, and even military dog sled teams. In 1943, a Labor Day celebration and barbecue was held in Idaho Springs. The barbecue meat was fresh elk killed by the 10th Mountain Troops on Mount Evans. In 1944, the Division of Wildlife decided to open the Mount Evans Game Preserve to all legal hunting except bighorn sheep. They had been protected statewide since before 1885. There were no goats at that time on Mount Evans or anywhere else at that time in Colorado. Again, the pendulum swung too far the other way, and the Mount Evans elk herd was depleted to the point of being hard to find during hunting seasons of the early 50s. Meanwhile, other elk herds and other game animals were doing quite well in Colorado. Clear Creek County had always had at least one herd of bighorn sheep. With total protection since 1885, the survivors of the market hunting era began to increase. Although they have had to overcome disease and parasites, the bighorn herds have spread to almost every mountain ecosystem above 8,000 feet in Clear Creek County, and in some areas much lower than that. The first hunting season for bighorns was held in 1953 with a drawing for a very limited number of licenses for mature rams. Colorado wildlife biologists have developed a system of baiting using alfalfa hay and apple pulp, an elaborate overhead net that can be dropped instantly, trapping 20 or 30 sheep at a time. Buff and I have helped many times at the trapping operation at the Georgetown site. Buff's brother Bill was instrumental in designing the net, adapting the principle of a net he had used to trap geese in Canada. Some of the trapped sheep would need doctoring, some released and some transplanted to strengthen smaller herds and start new herds. By carefully monitoring the herds for signs of disease and overcrowding, the Division of Wildlife is doing an excellent job of managing them.
I've got to interrupt here. That's MaryLou's first buck deer. That's a really strange rack. Usually they have a big wide rack, but he was tall and narrow, and she doesn't look too warm.
There was no Gore-Tex in my clothes, I tell you not. That site is just overlooking Handicap, a place we call Highland Park, if any of you know what I'm talking about.
You can jeep there.
And that old rifle that I was using then was open sights. It was a 30-30 long tom, we called it, and the barrel was at least 6 feet long, I think. Because of the strict laws, Because of the strict laws enacted in the early 1900s, the public became aware of the need for wildlife conservation. Bucks only became the standard for all big game hunters. When the size of the herds reached the point where increased hunting was needed for control, the game management biologists recommended the limited sale of licenses for the female of the species, even bighorn sheep. It took a while to overcome the public outcry against killing Bambi, but with education and the support of sportsmen's groups, the first licenses for antlerless deer and elk were issued in 1945. Later, hunter's choice licenses allowed hunters to take either a male or female animal. They were sold on a limited basis and good only in certain areas of the state. Today, all deer licenses and most elk licenses are obtained only through a drawing and are valid only in the area specified on the license. The state is divided into 185 separate game management areas, and Clear Creek County lies within 2 of these areas.
Game management, or game plentiful. Game management personnel were learning what practices did and did not work to manage herd sizes and have become quite good at it. In the late 1950s, 16 imported mountain goats were released on Mount Evans, and by 1964 they had done so well that the first goat season was held, but only 6 licenses were issued. Today, goats can be found from Mount Evans to Summit County, all from that same original herd. I believe there were some additional goats added sometime in the 60s or 70s to kind of increase the gene pool a little, but it was basically from that original herd of only 12 or 14, something like that.
Well, where did they bring them from?
Let's see, these the latest came from Canada and Montana, a few in each place. But the first, believe it or not, came from South Dakota, and or possibly North Dakota. It was from a kind of a game farm or a game preserve where they were really in captivity, and they had more than they needed, and so they brought them down here and turned them loose on Mount Evans. Clear Creek County is presently in a time of too many elk and deer for the available winter. I think our bighorn sheep and our goat populations are doing all right, but the herd size is about right for the area accessible to them in the summertime. But it's, of course, the winter range that keeps shrinking as we develop more and more land and so on. The increase in the number of bears and mountain lions recently is in part due to the abundance of prey, of course, but the recent changes in bear hunting laws have definitely favored the bear. And from 1885 to 1965, if you can believe, all those years, mountain lions were hunted year-round and a bounty paid on them. They were pretty scarce then. They are now considered a game animal with hunting seasons set and limits on the number killed. But we do still have confidence that the Division of Wildlife team can solve the current problems without overdoing it as in the past. Now we're going to bore you a little with the Rutherford family hunting history. I've hunted in Colorado almost every year since I was 12 years old, except for the years I was in the military service. And MaryLou has hunted with me since we were married 56 years ago, with a few years out for having babies. She killed her first elk in 1964.
That's that one, a little old.
Just a little better in the spine. We've hunted together in many parts of the state, but for the last 40 years, we've hunted only in the Gunnella Pass and Chicago Creek areas. When I was a teenager, my father found a perfect campsite with a spring and grass for the horses in the area that we had been hunting for 2 or 3 years in West Chicago Creek. We named it Camp Number 1, real
Original.
Like
number 1 lift, real original.
Since that time, about 1945, someone in our family has camped and hunted there every year for 63 years. I killed my first elk in the Mount Beardstadt area in 1944. In those years, we didn't have a horse trailer, so we would pack our complete camp with food enough for 3 or 4 people for 8 or 10 days on pack horses and ride our saddle horses from our yard in Georgetown. We have camped in other areas higher up on West Chicago Creek, but we always seem to return to Camp 1, and it's become our base camp.
In conclusion, Clear Creek County has many old mining and logging roads that have become jeep roads after World War II. These roads give hunters access to many of the alpine and subalpine zones where our wild game live. There is still a lot of country only accessible by foot or on horseback, and some only by foot. Having the luxury of owning horses allows us to pack camp in sometimes 2 or 3 separate trips, bringing game meat to camp and to pack it out. When season is over, our camp is also packed out on horses. For several past hunting seasons, our children and spouses and nephews have taken over much of the physical effort it takes to keep up the family tradition of camping at Camp 1. Grandpa Rutherford now has great-grandchildren hunting and camping from the campsite he found so long ago. We put together just a bunch of pictures that we're just going to go through quickly. If you have any comments, you're welcome to interject. but it's part of our lives, and we just had so much fun reliving all our own stories, even though it was just he and I talking. Well, Chris, he had to hear them. Okay.
This might be a good time, though, if anyone has questions about the history that we
Were the mountain goats ever
That's a big question. The biologists claim that they did because that was their purpose or their reasoning or their justification for reintroducing them. But later studies have pretty well proven that those early pictures that they had taken and were calling them mountain goats were really black and white photos of bighorn ewes. You know, they look a lot like goats. Although Chris would probably question that. Go ahead.
There's a reference from 1895 in the San Juans where they're very specific about calling it goats, but there weren't photos at that time, but they went on quite a bit.
But your description called them very white.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah.
So.
Frank?
Along that line, there is another newspaper account or narrative that's passed down over the years that I think it was it Teddy Roosevelt, Chris? Mm-hmm. Who was hunting in the southern part of the state, down the Canyon City area. Mm-hmm. And supposedly his guide, they shot this white animal, and when they got the guide looking at it, the guide said it was not a sheep. It was a horned white animal that he'd never seen before, and they dug a hole and buried it. And left. Left with a unicorn. Some people had said, it was a goat.
A double unicorn.
But that story floats around.
To the argument on the other side that they weren't here, they claim that where the Continental Divide dips down to only 6,000 feet in Wyoming, that prevented because the mountain goat is always has been, or supposedly anyway, a northern animal, a colder climate, and so that prevented them from following the Continental Divide on down. But of course, once they got down here with the higher rugged mountains, they were right at home again, the same as they would have been up in the mountains of Montana or Ontario. So who knows? It's one that probably never will be answered.
The game drive walls that you were talking about at the beginning, how tall would they have been?
They probably weren't over, of course they've, in that many thousands of years they've sunk into the ground, but the archaeologists don't believe they were over 3 feet tall. It was more of a drift, what we would call in the cowboy business is a drift fence. It would just kind of make them drift the way you want them to go. Yeah.
I'll add one more thing in that. I've seen this same kind of game drive walls in Alaska, especially up in the Brooks Range. And they were used much more recently than the ones down here. Well, we're still talking 1,000 years ago. But they were never more than at least 2 or 3 feet high when they were all the way up. 3 feet would be real high for them.
Yeah, that's what
as you were saying, it's just enough to turn the animals and they'll walk or drift along the route of that wall.
I would imagine where the walls had been there for years and years and years, there were probably game trails just following along them, where the game had gone when they weren't being harassed. Just walked along.
Sure.
What kind of game were they herding along those walls? Because you said the deer and the elk could jump and would jump. So
Well, no, they wouldn't jump unless they were being harassed or pushed. Deer, elk, and bighorn sheep. But archaeologists seem to think that in Clear Creek County, that would have been bighorn sheep mostly, more so than deer and elk.
herding along
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah. Diane?
MaryLou, were you a city girl when you met Bob?
Well,
Camping and stuff?
I was born and raised in Chicago, but that doesn't mean I was a city girl. I got that taken out of me a long time ago. Okay, Chris, go ahead. That was my first elk. I wasn't there when we gutted it and packed it on the horse, but I got a picture. It's a 6-point. I was pretty proud of that. And that's how we pack them out on our horses.
Those are, the elk is quartered, and the quarters are wrapped in cheesecloth to keep it clean, and then packed in canvas panniers on the horse's back.
That's Buff's brother Glenn in the foreground.
This is camp number 2.
Another.
This is near the head of, near closer to the head of West Chicago Creek. Believe it or not, that was taken the 13th of September. It was during black powder season, and I'd ridden up there to my son Bruce. I'd packed him in earlier, and I said I'll be back on a certain day to pack you out. And this was me coming to meet him. He took the picture when I got there, and it snowed 10 inches in Georgetown that morning, that day, and I don't know what it was up there. That's a nice bull that MaryLou got on a much nicer day. This is buck deer. That's just a couple of years ago. I'm riding MaryLou's horse because I'm using mine to pack the deer on. He doesn't seem to care what you put on his back, but try to put a whole deer with the antlers on the back of the horse I'm riding, and you've got a problem.
What did you do with MaryLou?
She came along to take the picture.
I got to walk.
That's like that Indian joke, How come squaw no got him no walk, no ride? Squaw no got him horse. That's another nice elk that MaryLou got.
Who's that with you, MaryLou?
It's our daughter-in-law, Patty.
Okay.
And this
I've been not replaced, I've been added to. It's really a joy because I was the only gal with all the boys for all those 40, 50 years, and which I loved every minute of it and didn't make any difference. But we all get a little tireder as we get older, and Patty is just broken in beautifully. Yeah, Liz.
Can you go back one, Chris? On that one, so it's late at night. Now, do you have to gut that thing? I mean, it's dark.
Actually, that's probably what we were doing. I think it was probably shot in the evening, just at the last light. And so we were trying to gut it, field dress it.
You have to gut it that night, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Field dress it then we would come back in the morning and skin it and quarter it, and probably pack it into camp, or maybe hang it on the shady side of a big spruce tree right close to where it is. We like to let our meat age for a few days before we start handling it much and packing it. This is camp number 1. We've had the last couple of years we've gotten caught up there in some pretty deep snow.
That was 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah. But there's a stove inside there and a nice fire going. And it's not as uncomfortable as it looks.
Yeah, right.
Then of course you have nice sunny days when you can just lay out and take a nap.
Oh, God.
And then
That's
there's
another-
those days.
Yeah,
It's a little cow.
That's a frozen elk. No, that's another case, Liz, where this is coming back the next morning after it had been field dressed to skin it and quarter it to find it was frozen solid. That just makes it harder work.
But you do it anyhow?
Oh, of course, yeah. Recently, our son Bruce has been experimenting with motion detection cameras. And there's a elk wallow where the bull elk use in the fall during the rutting season, not very far from our camp. And he set that camera up on the elk wallow and got a picture at night of a big 6-point bull. He's very much alive, and he's still alive as far as I know. This is right on top of Alpine Peak up
And have you
here.
ever been up to that tree? It's a beauty. It's a bristlecone pine. Georgetown's on the one side
On the
and
backside.
our hunting camp's on the other side. You can see
That's-
forever.
That's the remains of a big forest fire that burned all through West Chicago Creek, from Timberline near Hell's Hole, clear down and up to the rim tops toward Georgetown in 1907. And believe it or not, how that tree ever grew there in the first place is amazing, but the fact that it's been standing there dead for another 100 years, those bristlecone pine are so full of pitch that they don't rot, and apparently that one had a good tight hold on the rocks, and I think it's still there. And there's the meat when it's in our kitchen. That's a hind quarter of a fairly good sized bull, average sized bull.
Well, that was my bull in 06.
06.
Mhm.
That's a lot of work.
This is the area in West Chicago Creek where, I'll let you describe it and I'll point to it.
That little gold button on here. Here,
I gotta learn how to use this, huh?
yeah, just press that. It'll point to it.
Oh, okay. This ridge is the ridge between Clear Creek and West Chicago Creek. And the area that we hunt is all of this area in there. This was taken off of the South Chicago, or the main Chicago Creek ridge looking west. Don't ask me what those peaks are.
Okay.
That's got to be either gray. It's probably one of the pair, Grays and Tories.
Yeah,
Or
right
clear
on the
over in the
corner.
far corner there, yeah.
Why don't you use the stick behind you, because that...
That's better. That shows up better, yeah. Yeah, that would have to be Torres Peak. And this is the continental divide, pretty much along there to
Mines.
Mines Peak, above,
Don't touch.
she thinks I'm messing with the screen.
He does that with my computer all the time. Don't touch. Okay.
Anyway.
All right, Chris. And that's the reason why we live in this country, isn't it?
Is that-
That's it. Yep. Yeah.
I've got a question for both of you. When you talk about the good old days, are you talking about 50 years ago, or are you talking about right now? Right now. Probably the game, the hunting, at least all over, anywhere in Clear Creek County, is probably better right now, as good right now as it's ever been.
And Bob, I was going to say, I just remember the days too when Bumps Turner was our longtime game warden here. And back in, when I was growing up, I was born in 47, that was just, the game warden was much more active than the sheriff because they really did monitor poaching a lot. And, but they did turn their head if it was needed for a family to have food. But they really watched the herds quite carefully because they had been ravaged so much.
Now that you mentioned that, it just occurred to me, Bumps Turner was the last game warden that ever visited us in our hunting camp. Now they sit down on the road.
Very active on horses.
Yeah. Yeah, he would ride his horse up to our hunting camp.
Bob, do you have a poem you could...
Well, this isn't hunting, but it comes close. This is a cowboy's solution to this problem of what to do with fur animals. Make them into fur coats or what, So a little credit to Baxter Black. I'll tell you about his solution to the problem. Of late, there's been a modest debate concerning the wearing of fur. And some even swear that anyone who would wear it is flawed in their character. Yet others will fight to maintain their right to wear what they dang well please. But the answer lies in a compromise that sets both minds at ease. Now just imagine two friends at opposite ends who meet and do lunch once a week. Their friendship is tried when they gather outside of a Beverly Hills boutique. Sylvia, oh my soul, is that a mink stole? Please tell me it's fake from Goodwill. No, Babs, it is mink, but it's not what you think, because it's designer roadkill. Sure, you scoff, but don't blow it off. It's the wisdom of Solomon's voice. It's the perfect solution. It grants absolution, yet leaves the owner pro-choice. Wisdom that pure should forever endure and percolate down through your soul. So I'm the head gent of the Animal Accident Recovery Patrol. The AARP. That's MaryLou and me. We're out on the road every night to gently remind you that mess left behind you is more than a buzzard's delight. So carry a trowel for mammal or fowl to collect your vehicular blooper. And in time you'll find it's all in your mind. It's no worse than a pooper scooper. And you'd be amazed how activists will praise you for doing what you think is right. And no trapper will object if you stop to collect things that go bump in the night. So treat it with care and waste not a hair, H-A-R-E. Be sorry, but don't sit and pine, because accidents happen when we're both overlapping that double yellow line. So salvage your plunder and render your blunder into a warm winter coat. And remember our motto, which you know you ought to. It follows, and herein I quote, "Make it a habit to pick up your rabbit. Don't leave him to dry in the sun. For the sake of a garment, recycle your varmint. It's tacky to just hit and run."